do you think? Is a spot ETF approval a given?
Well, thank you for having me. And no, it's not. Gary Gensler and the SEC have done a very good job of really trying to regulate with the existing statutes how Bitcoin and other different kinds of coins are being regulated here. They have not had anything where they've let them onto a securities exchange yet, which is what you're talking about. There are coins on the commodities exchange because the regulatory scheme over there is different. So I think for them to let one onto a securities exchange, which they regulate as opposed to the commodity exchanges, is going to be a very difficult lift. And if it does happen, I would expect it's going to take a while, and there's going to be a fair amount of regulation written around it so that they can guard against the kinds of things that happen with some of these coins.
Now, what's interesting about this, too, is some of the pushback you've seen from the SEC has to do with safety and security around Bitcoin itself. If you think about the SEC's approving or not approving a new structure here, is it safer to buy Bitcoin under the ETF wrapper or not, given how much the structure has changed going into this process?
If it's all wrapped up into another kind of security or commodity, it may give you some additional safety, but still, at base root, if what you're looking at is a commodity like Bitcoin, which is really sort of, remember that these things were brought out, and the idea of them was get off the grid. They didn't want the SEC. They didn't want the CFTC, and they want to keep those things as much like that as possible. The problem with that is it creates huge problems. I understand, like, for example, that Hamas is now financing some of their operations with these kinds of products. So you might think about that when you want to go think about buying this stuff.
Well, Tom, I'm glad you brought that up because we know lawmakers on Capitol Hill are thinking about that. And actually, just last week, more than 100 of them, both in the Senate and the House, wrote a letter to the Treasury and Jake Sullivan over at the NSC saying, quote, that the deadly attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians comes as the group has become one of the most sophisticated crypto users in the terror finance domain, clarifies the national security threat crypto poses to the U.S. and our allies. Yet we have spoken, Tom, just last week with a cyber expert, former CIA, Yahya Fanusi, who's now with the Crypto Council of Innovation, who suggested the activity really wasn't all that great. And we know a lot of terrorist financing and other illicit activity is done in U.S. dollars. So what's your response here?
Well, the problem is that they're using this to finance their operations, and it's difficult to tell exactly how far they're going with this stuff. If they're using that, then what we have is terrorists using this medium that's traded freely in this country to raise money to inflict huge amounts of damage and injury and death on civilians. That shouldn't be allowed to be happening. But one of the things that makes it somewhat easy is you can take these crypto coins, you can trade them on a commodity regulation with little or no oversight, and you can raise money. You can't do that in the securities exchanges. It's much harder just because of the way you get on one exchange versus the other. But it's still a threat, and it's not something that we should be sanctioning when we're spending billions of dollars to try to protect people in these countries.